Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. We're very pleased to have you at another session of Discovery. My name is Emily. I am the Engagement Manager at Efficiency Canada. Efficiency Canada operates within Carleton University, and we acknowledge that the location of our campus sits on the traditional unceded territories of the Algonquin Nation. In doing so, we acknowledge we have a responsibility to the Algonquin people and a responsibility to adhere to Algonquin cultural protocols. Before we get started, a reminder to everyone that our guest speaker will present for 20 minutes, and then we will open the floor to questions. Please use the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom screen. This way, other people can upvote what they really want to hear about. And the chat will also be open if you'd like to share ideas or links that don't belong in the Q&A box. We do have a hard stop at 12:45 Eastern Time. So we might not be able to get to all of the questions considering this is a hot topic, but I'm sure Abhi will be able to share his contact info in the chat and you can get in touch with him if you have any questions that weren't answered today. So I'm very pleased to welcome our guest today, my colleague, Abhi. Abhi is a research manager here at Efficiency Canada. In this session, Abhi will present on the latest custom data from Statistics Canada Census 2021 and evidence from research to construct archetypes or user profiles of lived experiences with energy poverty. In doing so, we will explore how energy poverty amplifies existing vulnerabilities for Canadian households and make recommendations for targeted and decisive action to mitigate impacts for the most vulnerable households. So welcome, Abhi. Thanks for being here, and over to you.
Right on. Thanks, Emily, and thank you 100 people for joining us today, 100 and counting for this webinar. So like Emily said, we'll talk about some latest data and really get into measuring what matters. So one of my favorite things to do on this Discovery webinar really is to look at the number of participants in the bottom of my screen. And there's 100 of you who have signed up to learn about measuring energy poverty. My question to you is like, why, right? Why is this important to you? Why does this matter? Why bother really about measuring energy poverty? And if you have the latest data, what do you plan on doing with it? Now, if you're like me, what you measure really determines what you solve, right? So measuring a problem helps you understand like the scale of the issue, identify who is affected, how they're affected. We can then develop effective solutions that meets people where they're at, give them what they need, allocate resources accordingly, we can track progress, and we can hold our systems accountable for delivering on those outcomes. And so measuring energy poverty, really, the fundamental conceit of what we're trying to do here is to develop effective policy solutions to help Canadians who need it the most. Now, this is basically also the format that my presentation will follow today. We'll talk about what energy poverty is, we'll look at who is affected, how it affects them, we will talk about what solutions are effective, really, and then who is best positioned to deliver it and at what level. And then some insights from my perspective on how to track progress towards meeting our goals, and then how do we ensure that we are maintaining accountability. Now, the first challenge really is that is a sad state of affairs in Canada because we do not have, we are one of the few G7, G8 countries that does not have an official definition of energy poverty. But what we do know is we have a common understanding, right? Like we recognize it, we've heard stories about it, some of us may have experienced it, some of us may be developing programs or in the process of developing programs to address it. We've heard news stories about it. Roughly speaking, energy poverty really describes a situation where a household is unable to access adequate energy to maintain well-being in their own homes. Now, I'd like you to pay attention to each of these words because, spoiler alert, they will become very relevant. I want you to think about inability to access means, what adequate energy means, and what being means for people in their own homes. We also do not have an official measure or an indicator for a quantitative indicator or even a qualitative measure of what energy poverty looks like. What we do know is that there are certain root causes or common determinants. So end of the day, energy poverty is caused by a combination of one of these three things: high energy costs, low incomes or low disposable incomes, and then poor quality housing. Now, the interesting thing is these are not really independent variables. They kind of work in tandem and reinforce each other. So if you live in a leaky home and you experience low incomes, chances are that a greater portion of your income goes towards paying your energy bills. And similarly, if you are a low income household in Canada, chances are you live in a house that's not built to modern energy building standards and codes. As a consequence, you experience high energy costs. So these factors are related, but they work in tandem, reinforce each other to produce what is commonly known as energy poverty. Now, given this, what we can do is come up with some proxy indicators for energy poverty, a set of variables that we can use to approximate what and measure what energy poverty is. So here is one of those proxies that is very commonly used in Canada. It's called energy cost burdens. Now, what this means is it's a ratio of energy bills to after-tax income. It measures what portion of your income you're paying on for energy bills. And so it's 6%, right, is a commonly used threshold. Now, a lot of thresholds are arbitrary, but 6% has some significance here because according to 2021 census data, custom tabulated by us here at Efficiency Canada, about a median household in Canada spends about 2% of their after-tax income on home energy use. So a household that spends 3 times as much, so 6% or more, can be used as a proxy for defining really what we call energy poverty. Based on that metric, here's the drum roll, latest census data. About 1 in 7 Canadian households is at the risk of experiencing energy poverty. So it's about 2 million households across Canada. Now, there is another way that you can combine these root causes. So you can look at energy costs and housing costs, right? So you can kind of get at like housing affordability. One way of thinking about this is that if a significant portion of your total housing costs is going towards energy bills, then maybe reducing energy bills can help improve housing ability. So by that metric, using that as a proxy indicator, here is what those numbers look like. And as you see, similar to the previous proxy indicator, nearly every province across the country and territory across the country does experience, households in the near every province and territory do experience energy poverty by this metric. And by this yardstick, 1 in 5 Canadian households experience energy poverty. So reducing kind of energy costs for these households in some way of thinking about this can make housing more affordable for Canadians. Now, these are 2 proxy indicators fairly commonly used in practice. Granted, there is no official definition. What is missing from this picture, right? So remember, our goals are to identify who it affects the most, identify and come up with solutions to target those most in need in a way that meets them where they're at in their daily lives. So these proxy indicators paint a good high-level picture, but I think they are a little incomplete, and I think they can use a little bit more examination and looking a little bit more closely. So what does energy poverty actually look like in the lives of people that experience it, right? So we did research looking at lived experience of energy poverty in other jurisdictions, what academics say, research says. We spoke to practitioners in Canada who work directly with people experiencing energy poverty. And like I told you earlier, spoiler alert, each of these words will be relevant. So the inability to access and what constitutes adequate energy, what being means to you in your own home is subjective. It is unique to each household. It is deeply personal. It's experienced deeply personally. And a lot of this happens behind closed doors. This is conditioned by social practices. How much energy is adequate really depends on your energy needs, and based on your demographic profile, your socioeconomic conditions, those might change. What constitutes like a ease of access to energy? That depends again on your context of your life, and what really is about being is a deeply subjective and personal experience. So what we learned is the way that energy poverty actually shows up in the lives of people, it really manifests as like negative outcomes to housing and health. So this is just a short list Yeah, so a number of these things, financial stress, kids have trouble sleeping and focusing and concentrating on homework. You have inadequate heating. There's your windows are drafty. There's frost inside your walls. There's mold and mildew, damp conditions, a risk of falling, poor indoor air quality, long-term illnesses, respiratory problems. There's a whole set of experiences that really, the way that energy poverty shows up in the lives of people that is relevant when we're trying to really measure what we want to solve. And if these are the range of issues and problems that we need to address, then it makes sense to pay attention to how this shows up. And so that icon you see on the top right, it means that this is a resource alert. So we have Emily might pop that this in the chat. So we have a deep dive into literature connecting housing inequalities, health outcomes, with energy poverty. And that resource will be available on our hub. If it's not already up there, you can sign up for a newsletter and you will get it when we have it ready for you. So going back to thinking about what solutions are effective. So how do solutions look like from the perspective of people that deal with energy or suffer from energy poverty the most, the consequences for whom are most dire? And what does it look like from the perspective of those that need solutions the most is the next step in measuring, because what you measure determines what you can solve. And so we talked about how energy poverty shows up as negative outcomes, and it makes sense to unpack what these negative outcomes are and how it manifests as physical and mental health in the lives of people and in negative housing outcomes. So again, going back into research, what the academic research and practice in other jurisdictions that have had a longer history of kind of defining, measuring, taking action on energy poverty, and some academics here in Canada as well who have started really doing a lot of research in energy poverty. What their conceptualization of energy poverty is that the best way to understand energy poverty and the way it shows up in lives of people is that it amplifies a household's existing vulnerability to negative health and housing outcomes. So what this means is that their households, by virtue of their underlying, by socio-demographic, socioeconomic conditions, experience a level of vulnerability to bad health or bad housing as a result of living in their own homes. And what energy poverty does is that it amplifies those vulnerabilities, especially if households have an inability to respond adequately. Now, let me try to illustrate this with an example. So let's look at seniors in Canada, right? What we know from qualitative research and quantitative data, census, seniors in Canada are more likely to already experience or already be vulnerable to what we call core housing needs. So in colloquial terms, core housing need means you live in a house that doesn't quite meet your needs because it's either unaffordable or overcrowded or it's unsuitable for seniors, are also at a higher risk for cardiovascular conditions as a result of the conditions of their home. And seniors are also more likely to experience slipping and falling in their own homes. And also the consequences of slipping and falling in their homes is particularly more dire for seniors. So these are some underlying conditions. Seniors in Canada are vulnerable to these negative outcomes by virtue of living in their own homes. Now, let's take an energy-related risk factor, for example. So cold and drafty homes. What research shows is that seniors living in cold and drafty homes are at a higher risk of experiencing cardiovascular conditions. They are at a higher risk of experiencing slips and falls. The consequences of slips and falls are also more dire for seniors in cold and drafty homes, because my understanding is, again, I'm not a health expert, I'm reflecting what I've learned from research conducted in the context of this project, is that as temperatures inside your home decrease, mobility decreases, there can also be condensation and cold spots in your home, and that combination of those things increases the risk of slips and fall and dire consequences and injuries for seniors. Now, if these are the conditions, these conditions are further exacerbated and they show up in different ways in different households based on their ability or inability to respond. So if you're a senior with limited savings or limited access to debt or capital, you may not have the ability or the means to respond to this adequately by improving the energy efficiency of your home or conducting an energy retrofit or applying for a greener homes program, for example. If you're a renter, regardless of what your income is, you do not have the permission really or the ability to make material upgrades to your home. So regardless of your income conditions, if you're a renter, you are now at a greater risk of experiencing vulnerability in your own home because of a combination of these circumstances. This is, again, recent research shows from Statistics Canada that there is a big gap in digital literacy between seniors and people aged, let's say, 55 and under. There's almost, for seniors who are like 8 years and older, there's almost like a 35% gap in digital literacy. But what I mean is seniors, as Canadians age, they are less and less likely to use internet, or they're less and less likely to, or they're likely to need more resources navigating complex systems of support. So if you launch a new program, Cleaner Homes, for example, and you make it available online, seniors are unlikely to make use of that, so they have a less of an ability to respond to these emerging risks and challenges and the ways in which it shows up in their lives. And I'll give you another quick example. Let's take single-parent households. What we know in Canada, a vast majority, I believe about 80% of single-parent households in Canada are single-mother households. They have significant caregiving responsibilities and what we call depleted resilience, and they're stretched too thin in terms of resources and time. And we also know from research on incomes on single-parent households that they are often underemployed or unemployed. And as a consequence, if they experience damp and moldy walls in their own home, it elevates the risk of respiratory illnesses in kids, and kids struggle to maintain focus and concentrate on homework. And so these consequences of energy poverty casts a long shadow across the lives of people who experience it. So it's not just about utility, not being able to pay utility bills, although that is a problem. It is not just about your utilities being disconnected, although that is a problem. When we unpack, and this academics love this word, unpacking, when we unpack energy poverty, what we realize is that depending on your underlying vulnerabilities, what energy poverty does is it amplifies the negative health and housing outcomes that you're already vulnerable to, especially if you lack the ability to respond adequately. This journey map between underlying vulnerabilities, housing quality, housing condition, housing type, social demographic conditions, energy-related risk factors, health and housing outcomes, this entire journey map is the universe of energy poverty. And so you see the resource alert there on the top right. We've developed what we call like user profiles or archetypes for each of these social demographic groups, taking a look at research conducted in Canada on health and housing inequality and elsewhere, and connecting that with some insights from Statistics Canada on quantitative and qualitative vulnerabilities that these demographic groups face with housing and health outcomes, and we've mapped what the universe of energy poverty could look like. Okay, so now that we know here's the universe of the energy poverty, what can we do about it, right? So let's go back to our mutually reinforcing determinants. So low incomes, high energy costs, poor quality homes. Now, yes, you can subsidize energy costs for people, and that'll solve a small set of problems, maybe. Yes, we would all be in favor of that, improving the material quality of lives of people with better jobs, more stable incomes, higher incomes. That would address a certain set of problems. But our focus here at Efficiency Canada is on improving the quality of the homes. Actually, energy retrofits are a more long-term solution for a larger set of the universe of risks, vulnerabilities, and outcomes that we identified earlier. So with targeted and inclusive energy efficiency and retrofit policies, we can address underlying vulnerabilities, we can reduce their energy-related risk factors, we can improve people's resilience to their vulnerabilities, and we can undo harms and improve the quality of life and being for our fellow Canadians. So armed with all this information, what we can do is go back and try to propose a definition of our energy poverty. This is my personal view. I find it very useful to think about energy poverty as a set of overlapping social and economic inequalities, and really think about it, Canada's national priorities that can be addressed if you lead solutions with targeted energy efficiency. You want to solve climate change, let's lead with energy efficiency, identify households that need it the most and target them. You want to improve housing affordability, you want to improve health outcomes, you want newcomers to have a sense of belonging in homes that meet their needs, you want seniors to age in place. So any number of national priorities that you want to meet. If you're using targeted energy efficiency as a tool, you can get to efficient homes for all, which are affordable and meet their needs, healthy, so that it ensures physical, emotional, and financial well-being in their homes, and then climate ready, so that the homes can meet the needs of people as the climate is changing and prepare them to participate in the future of a net zero economy. Now, given this kind of rough definition or framework of energy poverty, here is my suggested energy poverty reduction goal. I'm basing this off of the UK, which has their measure of energy poverty baked into their national climate targets, is that by 2030, and they have interim targets by 2050, by 2030, no low-income household in UK will live in a house below modern energy standards. So they have a national building labeling that helps them identify households from best performing, grade A, to like worst performing, grade G. And so they say by 2035, no low-income household will live in below grade C, which is like roughly if a house was built to a modern energy standards. So I'm using that and bouncing off of that based on what we now talked about is energy poverty is amplifying existing vulnerabilities. I think if you want to solve a set of overlapping problems, I think a good target and a definition for energy poverty is that by 2035, no Canadian household vulnerable to energy poverty, or vulnerable to the impacts, to the negative impacts to housing and health and daily life, will live in a home that's rated below modern energy standards. So a house built today in Canada, in your province, in your jurisdiction, to whatever the prevailing modern building code is, let's make sure that by 2035, whatever the building codes are, that no vulnerable household, and however we choose to define it, right? We can get into that a little bit later. No Canadian household that's vulnerable lives in a house that's below modern standards. So what this does, it really puts the focus on improving homes and houses to improve quality of life for people and helping us meet our other climate goals. Now, I have a couple more slides, but I'll stop here because I think I can get to the slides because I can already anticipate some questions people are asking. This research was funded in part by the CMHC under the National Housing Strategy, for which I and the rest of us at Efficiency Canada are super grateful. Emily, I'll turn it back over to you.
Amazing. Thanks, Abhi. And thank you for already knowing what's coming up in the Q&A. So I don't know what your next slides are, so I might not be asking the right questions to get to them. But this has come up a few times. So speaking of the 6% income threshold metric, what is left out of it? And why is the 6% chosen versus 10%?
Yeah, that's a great question. So how do we even know how much energy people are spending in their own homes, right? The data for that comes from one small line item in the long-form census in Canada, where they ask, how much did you spend on energy over the last year? Now, there's 160 people in the audience. I'm willing to bet $160 that no single person can accurately tell me how much they spent on energy in the past year. And so what we did is we asked Statistics Canada to take that self-reported number and divide that by the family's after-tax income to determine what the ratio is. Now, 6% is relevant for like three different reasons. One, that it has some history in Canada. There has been research and there has been other energy poverty mapping tools that have used 6% as the threshold to say above this threshold, if you're spending a disproportionate portion of your income above 6%, you are considered to be in energy poverty, understanding that it is a proxy, right? So first thing is it does have some kind of history and momentum towards the metric. Second way of looking at it is that in other jurisdictions, they regard if you spend more than 20% of your housing costs on energy, then you're regarded to be spending disproportionate portion of your income on energy. And in Canada, we say if you spend more than 30% of your income On housing, then you're considered to be living in unaffordable housing. So 20% of 30%, so 20% of your energy, 20% of your housing costs, which are 30% of your income, gives you 20% multiplied by 30% gives you 6%. Now, another way of looking at this is that you can say, okay, what is a median household, like an average household in Canada, what percentage of their after-tax income do they spend on energy? And so it turns out in 2021, it's 2%. In 2016, it was 3%. In 2021, it's 2%. So 6% would mean that households are spending 3 times as what relative to their income, what a median household spends. So that's how you arrive at 6%. What is missing from that number really is a whole bunch of things. One is that we don't know, for example, how many households are self-rationing energy use. So people who turn down their thermostats every year, artificially keeping their energy bills low, so that because they can't afford their bills, right? So those numbers might not show up in the data. A significant portion of renters, their utility bills are baked in to their rent. And so their rent reflects utility bills. And so their data might not show up. There are a number of households that do not report an income, either because they've retired or things like that. They might not show up in the data. So there are certain gaps with using a threshold. And so the threshold is closer than the Wild West where we have no definition, but it is still incomplete. Now, 6% versus 10%, end of the day, any threshold is somewhat arbitrary, but in my view, 6% has some momentum to it, is related to housing and incomes and energy costs. It also is 3 times what an average household spends. That seems to me like a reasonable threshold.
Thanks, Abhi. Quick follow-up. You did mention this in your answer, but Tom is calling it a pre-bound effect. So someone that's turning down their heating or cooling ahead of receiving the energy bill in order to avoid it. Is there a way to adjust the data for that pre-bound effect, or is that unable to be considered?
Yeah, I think one way to do it, some other jurisdictions do it, is not quantitatively, but qualitatively, is to survey people. And actually some national census in other jurisdictions ask people if they are experiencing inadequate temperatures in their home, right? And so that accounts for like pre-bound effect and things like that. Maybe there's a way to do it at the national level. In my view, that this is a great role for municipalities at the local level to play, is to understand the scale of this pre-bound effect and the extent to which people reduce their energy use. There's some really good research coming out of the US that shows that low-income households will turn on their air conditioning much later on in the heating season and turn off the thermostat much later on in the winters and so on. So we have some indicators, but it's hard to come up with a quantitative number for that.
Thank you. Kate is asking if you have data to quantify the negative effects of households living in energy poverty.
Kate, I'll turn it back to you. What kind of data would be quantified? In the US, what they've done, they've had a long history of what they call weatherization assistance programs, 50 years of federal funding to help low-income households improve energy efficiency in their home. Some of the research that they have undertaken shows, decreased in the local health region, decreased incidence of house seniors experiencing falls, decreased incidences of children experiencing asthma, things like that. It would be very productive if we, as a part of national energy poverty reduction, to periodically, and this is what in the US they do every 5 years and 10 years, they do a review of the program to look at these try to identify quantitative metrics like of non-energy benefits. Would be productive to do something like that here in Canada as well, because we can look at health data, we can look at the decreased risk of illnesses and things like that, and soldier on.
Thanks, Abhi. So it seems that poverty in a wider sense is at the root of energy poverty. Do you think, and why do you think, specifically addressing energy poverty is a good starting point for getting at poverty?
I knew it. So yes, energy poverty and poverty in general are related. And so if you took that 6% indicator as a proxy, you will see here, so these are income deciles. I can never pronounce that word, deciles, I think. So dividing Canada's population in tenths by income, right? So lowest 10% income, second lowest 10% income, all the way to the top 10% income. So if we used 6% of energy cost burden as the threshold of energy poverty, you will see that there is a correlation. The lower your income is, the more likely it is that the household will experience high energy cost burdens and so on. Now, It is not just the consequences of low incomes, though, because it is not just about your inability to pay bills, or it's not just about what percentage of income are you paying on bills. What we're really talking about here is that people's well-being and in their own homes. As we saw earlier in the example of seniors living in a home that can be described as energy poverty because it's caused by combination of either low incomes, poor housing quality, and high energy bills. And if they live in a home that's cold and drafty, regardless of what their income is, they experience an elevated risk of physical, mental, and housing-related harms. Now, solving that problem is going to take a set of approaches that can bring in new resources, new techniques, new networks, and new professionals. So it is not just an anti-poverty measure. It's not just giving people more money. It's not just that, but it also we need to retrofit people's homes in order for them to live in homes that meet their energy needs and standards. If we want to get to our climate goals, we need to retrofit homes. And thinking about energy poverty, there is significant overlap between poverty, anti-poverty, and dealing with energy poverty, but it does require a set of new tools in the toolbox, and the biggest one of which, in my view, is targeted energy efficiency retrofit. So we can solve an overlapping set of problems that can't just be solved by anti-poverty efforts alone.
Thanks, Abhi. We have a couple of questions about Greener Homes 2.0. Can you speak a bit about policy recommendations that you have for Greener Homes 2.0 that might focus on renters, tenants, and how it might be implemented?
I'm glad you asked, because we did actually write a report on how to improve rental energy efficiency in Canada. And Emily, if you have the link handy, you can link to it, or we can send it to you in the show notes. So really looking at Greener Homes 2.0, first of all, there are a whole bunch of existing programs in the country, right? In almost every province, with the exception of Alberta, has targeted energy efficiency programs for income qualified homes. And they've been doing some fantastic work. We wrote a paper on that about a year and a half ago, in engaging about 50,000 to 60,000 households in Canada receive no-cost turnkey upgrades from a low-income energy efficiency programs. And these programs have like name recognition. They have earned the trust of vulnerable communities. They have mature delivery partners and networks, and they've been in the business for a long time, and they're doing some really cool, amazing things. But they do have some limitations. And I think what a Greener Homes 2.0, should there be one, you've heard hints that they will include a focus on low to moderate income households. So from my view, the unique role the federal government can play is one, just really defining what energy poverty is and setting some targets, like we discussed, high-level targets, and then letting provincial programs adopt measures that meet their own context and that can meet the overall goals. So the federal government can set like high-level goals so that provincial programs can then attempt to work within those guidelines and do deeper measures. One thing that provincial programs don't have the mandate to do is to do health and safety upgrades. In the US, for example, what the federal funding does is, while local programs do energy efficiency upgrades, while people are already in the homes doing upgrades, the federal funding can pay for health and safety upgrades like asbestos removal, mold remediation, lead paint removal, carpet cleaning and dusting, anti-slip measures, and so on. So that I think the federal government can really enhance existing provincial programs and elevate them to deliver deeper savings, make homes climate ready, target those in need. So in the US, what the federal funding does is it works with provincial programs to target seniors, people living with chronic illness and long-term illness and disabilities, people with single parents with young children at home. And so these are the different, and focus on households that need it the most. So I think that is the role the federal government can play, not come out with a program where you have to apply online and then you have to pay money up front, wait for your refund checks to come back, which I'm hearing can take like 24 weeks, not a program that has prescriptive measures that says only if you have oil heat and only if you live in a certain geography and only if you do a certain kind of heat pump. I don't think that's the appropriate role for the federal government. Existing programs are doing great work. They have some limitations. Set some high-level objectives, set a national agenda for energy poverty, and let provincial programs meet them by giving them some supplemental funding.
Thanks, Abhi. So related topic, do you have any suggestions on how to convince senior utility executives that there is value in spending ratepayer dollars on initiatives to reduce energy poverty? How do you make the business case from the utility perspective?
I do not know, and I'll tell you why. because there may or may not be a business case for why ratepayers' money. And so again, this is a limitation of provincial programs. Provincial programs are subject to cost effectiveness tests. They're subject to using their governance compels them to use ratepayer money on measures that significantly reduce energy use and give you the highest bang for buck, right? And so provincial programs are prioritized to do measures that reduce energy use or identify households that are target-rich environments for significant energy reductions. Even when there are tangential benefits in doing so, they're not prioritized making a business case for health and safety. And I think this is where a federal government and federal funding can apply. And then also funding from like local public health and private foundations, municipalities can help, is that provincial programs have a solid business case for doing energy efficiency upgrades, adding supplemental funding and orienting programs, having a national goal of like making sure no vulnerable household lives in a house below a certain standard. I think those will set the ecosystem under which programs operating under business as usual business cases can still function in ways that elevates housing quality for a vast number of vulnerable Canadians.
Thanks, Abhi. I think we'll cut it off there with only 2 minutes to go. There are a ton more questions that we're not getting to. I apologize. I think a lot of them may be answered by all of the relevant links that we've shared in the chat. So you've got a link to our low-income hub or energy poverty hub, where all of Abhi's great research will be posted, policy briefs, etc. There's also a handy button there on the page where you can sign up to receive all future energy poverty research that is published by Efficiency Canada, as well as events like this one, all things related to energy poverty. So I encourage you to go sign up on the Low Income Hub. So Abhi, thank you for joining us today. I think you'd get a standing ovation if we were in person. It's a great conversation, and thanks for the great questions to the audience. So yes, this session was recorded. I know a lot of folks were asking. I think everyone wants to rewatch it. It will be posted on our YouTube channel in the next week or so. And you can find all of our previous discovery sessions under the events tab on our website, should you be looking for them. In the meantime, do stay connected, sign up to receive our mailing list, our newsletter, and all energy efficiency developments from across the country. All right, thanks again for joining us today. Happy Friday. Thanks, Abhi. Bye, everyone.